So this week we pick up on part 2 of the Gospel of Mark. Now we are going through the 4 Gospels, and we're just going to have 2 sermons on each one as we get a fuller picture of the context and the authorship and all the things that help us understand these 4 different perspectives of Jesus. And last week we learned quite a bit about Jesus from the Gospel of Mark and looking at the first half. And this week we're going to wrap it up with the second half of the Gospel and what Jesus and what Mark was trying to tell us about who Jesus is and what he came to do. And so I'm just going to ask, would you bow your heads with me as we just open the Word with a prayer? Father in heaven, this message is given us by you through probably the Apostle Peter, written down by his scribe Mark, and preserved through generations and almost 2,000 years now, preserved for us to have an eyewitness account of who you were, what you came to do, what you taught us, and the events of your life. And Lord, today as we open this word, I pray that you will speak to us, that your message will hit home to our hearts, and that those of us who have come hungry for a word from you will hear what you have to say to us today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I remember like it was yesterday, I was at a pastor's meeting with all the pastors and all the teachers of the Potomac Conference. And they do this on average about once a year, and they gather all the employees of the Potomac Conference together. And we were in Charlottesville, North Carolina at a huge hotel convention center there. And it was lunchtime, and they had a buffet line there. And as we were kind of mingling and getting into line and finding places to sit and to eat and kind of catching up with old friends and our colleagues, I saw this one gentleman who I had never seen at the pastor's teachers' meetings before. And he was very tall. In fact, I was looking up to him. And he had what looked to me like a California haircut with long hair and kind of around the sides of his face. And I asked somebody, I said, well, who is this guy? He just stands out. He doesn't look like your typical pastor. And so somebody said, oh, he's the new pastor at such and such a church. I said, wow, okay, that's interesting. And so I decided, since he's new, that I should introduce myself. He probably doesn't know that many people. And so I walked up to him and I said, hey, I'm Pastor Rick Johns. And at that point, I was pastor in Richmond, Virginia. And I told him a little, and I said, and welcome to the conference. He said, thank you. He says, yeah, I'm brand new here and just came from Colorado and Denver area, and I'm happy to be here. And so we kept talking, and I found out that he was 6'8", and that explained why I was so looking up to him, and that he had not always been a pastor. He had actually worked in healthcare, in the Adventist healthcare system, in the financial area, and he had a degree in finance, etc. But he had felt the call to ministry, and now in his 30s, he had become finished at Andrews, and this was his first church here in Virginia. And so after that conversation, later I saw him at another meeting, and a friendship developed. And as I got to know him, he became my good friend, Matt. And Matt and I have been friends now, I think since that was about 9 or 10 years ago when I first met him. And his journey has been quite interesting, and mine has been quite interesting. But what I remember is that first day I met him thinking, who is this? This guy, he didn't, with his long hair and his height, he didn't look like the pastor. The rest of us looked a little more similar, but he looked different. He stood out, and so I thought, who is this guy? And in the Gospel of Mark, that is one of the questions that is being asked and answered. Who is this Jesus? He doesn't look quite like the other religious leaders. He doesn't speak the same way the other religious leaders speak. There's something different about this guy. And you remember that even the disciples in Mark chapter 4, after seeing Jesus calm a storm, think about that one, to the wind stops at his command, the waves die down at his command. The storm goes away when he asks it to. After seeing this, they look at each other and they say, "Who is this? Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" And so this question is asked from the beginning of the gospel all throughout it. And we get to Mark chapter 8. And if you have your Bibles, we'll begin here in Mark chapter 8. We get to the center of this gospel. This gospel is 16 chapters long. And just as a reminder, the chapters and the verses were added to the stories and to the Bible much, much later. Okay, so when this gospel was written by John Mark, there were no chapters or verses, but it is basically right in the center of this story that we have this particular Mark chapter 8 and this particular story starting in verse 27. And it says that Jesus and his disciples, verse 27 of Mark 8, went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am? Who am I? What are people saying? What have you heard? What are they talking about?" And by this time, quite a buzz has been generated, and you should know this is probably around the 3-year mark. Mark goes rapidly through the first few years of Jesus' ministry. There's not a lot of time spent on those first few years. But as soon as it gets to the last week, Mark slows way down. And almost the whole last 8 chapters are almost that whole last week. By chapter 10, we're in the last week of Jesus' ministry. So he slows way down because he's obviously telling us that last week is what it's all about. That's why he came. But anyway, we're here now after probably about 3 years of ministry, and Jesus is having this conversation with his disciples. Who do the people saying I am? And so his disciples replied in verse 28, "Well, some say John the Baptist. You're another John the Baptist. You've come and the two of you had this similar message and this similar authority, and there's something powerful about you guys. Others say that you're Elijah," and they were looking for Elijah to come. There were prophecies in the Old Testament that said before the Messiah would come, Elijah would come first to prepare the way of the Lord. And then others, he said, they told him, they say you're a prophet. You're just another one in those great line of prophets that we've had in the nation of Israel. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" And this is the question that I think Peter, who's relaying this gospel to Mark, that I think Peter wants you to answer this morning. Who do you say Jesus is? Sure, other people have their opinion. Sure, your friend down the street. Sure, your parents. Sure, your coworker. They each have their thoughts on Jesus. And Jesus is a figure who generates lots of variety of different responses. Even to this day, Jesus is a controversial figure. Some say he was a deceiver. Some say he never even existed. Some say he was just a good teacher. Some say he might have been the Son of God. Some say he was a good teacher, but he probably never raised from the dead. Some say it was all made up just by people who were zealous for a new religion and wanted to take over the world with this religion. But this question comes down to us through the generations. Who do you say I am? What do you think? What do you think about Jesus today, this morning, this week? Does your opinions about Jesus change? Is it different one week than another? Well, Peter, he answers. And it's no doubt that Peter would remember this story since he is a key figure in it. And he took this question personally and he said to Jesus, "You are the Christ," meaning the Messiah or the Anointed One. And this we see from the gospel is the correct answer. This is the answer that I think Jesus was hoping for. And it comes kind of at the center of the whole gospel, that finally now someone is starting to understand who Jesus is. But unless we think that Peter is making himself look good, let's keep reading. Jesus warned them, don't tell anybody who I am. By the way, this would have bothered the disciples because everything they knew about the Messiah and what he was supposed to do, that this long-awaited promised one, the Son of David who was supposed to come, he was supposed to throw off the yoke of all oppressors. He was supposed to take the throne. He was supposed to restore the glory of all of Israel. So this constant warning from Jesus, don't tell anyone, keep it quiet, this would have driven them nuts. And so Jesus says to them in verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the teachers, and that he must be killed and after that rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and rebuked him. And Peter's like, I'm sick of hearing this. All right, Jesus, you got this all wrong. Don't you know? You're the Messiah. This is what you're supposed to do. But when Jesus, verse 33, turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, get behind me, Satan. For you do not have in mind the things of God, but what? The things of men. Don't worry, Peter wasn't telling this story to make himself look good. It was at this story that Peter was so convinced, Lord, this is who you are. This is what you're supposed to do. Here's the route you're supposed to go. You keep talking about these other crazy things like keeping it silent and being rejected and being killed. No. This is not the Messiah. The Messiah is the all-powerful one. The Messiah rises to glory. The Messiah brings the glory of Israel back. The Messiah takes the throne of David. So, Lord, quit talking like this. And this is the only time anyone is rebuked so harshly by Jesus. Get behind me, Satan. And it's an interesting yet powerful thing for Jesus to say. Because I think even Jesus in his humanity had some temptation to maybe do this a different way. Right? Can you imagine knowing that your whole purpose in coming, your whole ministry, your whole mission is that you are going to be tortured and killed to give your life for others? That would be a real downer if God let you know this is what I'm calling you to. That would be difficult. We like to somehow think, oh, Jesus, he was the Son of God, so, he was all happy to go and sacrifice and give his life. If we forget, in Garden of Gethsemane, he is trembling before God, asking, begging, pleading that this cup should be passed from him. In order to give his life, he had to take all the sins of you and I upon himself. He had to become our sacrifice. He had to become the sin of this world in order for us to be set free, for us to become his righteousness. So he had that hanging over him. And so when Peter comes, I think Jesus, even though we might say, oh, I'm sure he knew his mission and he was dedicated to it and all that, I think that's true. But let's not forget he had a human side. And all of us as humans, when we know there's trouble ahead, we try to avoid it, don't we? If we know there's something difficult ahead, if we know there's something that's going to be really hard for us coming up, our human nature will do everything we can to try to go left or right or turn around, go back, sideways. Humans do not have a good track record when it comes to doing the right thing in the face of adversity. From the Israelites all the way down to our generation. There's something about us that we want to avoid the hard. We want to avoid the difficult. We want to avoid, even if we know it's right, even if we know we need to do it, even if we know it's good for us. The temptation to just try to shortcut it, to try to avoid the suffering, to try to avoid the pain. And I don't know what you're going through right now, but I know you live in a sinful world and you're probably going through something. There's some challenge or trial or something that's got you worried or stressed. And I know your first human reaction is, how can I get out of this? What can I do? What's the quickest way? How can I dismiss it, not deal with it? How can I get it off my plate, get it out of my sight, get it behind me, get it over here? How can I move? What do I need to do so I don't have to deal with this anymore? It's human nature. And even Peter was like, Jesus, come on, let's not do, like, what are you talking? That's crazy talk. That sounds way too hard. Let's do it my way. And it's interesting that Jesus says, and I think it's a profound statement that guides his whole life. You do not have in mind the things of God, but you're talking as a man. You're talking as a sinful human because that's the way sin operates. Sin wants to avoid any suffering, any pain, anything that might be uncomfortable. Even if it's the right thing, we seek to avoid it. And so Jesus says, I have in mind the things of God, and I have to keep that in front of me, so get behind me, Satan. You might show me an easier way. And you remember at the temptations of Jesus in the desert that Satan put him up on that mountaintop and said, hey, Jesus, you're going to have to die to save this world, to take back ownership. I'll give you an easier way. Just bow down to me. I'll just give you the world. Well, we don't have to go through the cross and all of this suffering and sacrifice. You don't have to bear their sins. You want this world? I'll give it to you right here, right now. Maybe not so much a temptation for us, but I think it was a real temptation for Jesus. Because in his humanity, he had to wonder if he could really do it. And he understood better than we ever will what was at stake and how hard it was going to be. You know, when it comes to this Jesus and who do we say he was, and who do you say he is personally, we have to consider this incredible sacrifice. And that's what Peter wants us to understand, is that in the first 8 chapters, we saw that he really was the Son of God with all power and authority, and he could cast out demons and he could heal people. But he came not to be the powerful leader, not to be the powerful king that won territories and dominated the world and that ruled this world with glory. He came to be the suffering servant. And the next 8 chapters, Peter portrays Jesus on his mission to give his life. And there's 3 things, there's 3 times where Jesus talks to his disciples about this. And I have a little graph I'm going to put on the screen. And you have chapters 8, 9, and 10. That's 3 right in a row, where Jesus says to his disciples, the Son of Man is going to be killed. The Son of Man is going to be rejected. The Son of Man has come to give his life. And in all 3 cases, the disciples are upset. They don't like it. They dismiss it. The disciples, they get in an argument in chapter 10, the next chapter, or chapter 9, the next chapter about who's the greatest. And in every case, they miss what Jesus is saying. And so you see in this case, Peter pulls him aside, he rebukes him. And then that leads Jesus to say in verse 34, he called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, if anyone's coming after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. And what good is it for a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? And so Jesus, every time his disciples try to say, no, God, the Messiah, it's this glorious position, it's going to lead to glory and all these great things, Jesus says, no, you don't understand. That's not my mission. And he says, guess what? If you're going to be my disciple, that's not your mission either. And Jesus speaks to us. And I think this is still as relevant to us as it was to the disciples of that day, because all of us as born as sinful humans, we have this thing, I like to call it the ego. We have this part of our sinful nature that we think, you know what, life is great if I can just build myself up, if I can just get more of this and be better at that and have more wealth and more status and more fame and more. And we live in a culture and a world that's obsessed with becoming greater. I must increase. And our ego is always looking to kind of puff ourselves up, to look a little better than someone else, to compete with this person. Am I doing better than them? Am I the next one in line for the promotion? Am I the whatever? And the problem with this ego is that it actually makes us miserable. It actually ruins our life. And you're saying, well, Pastor, we shouldn't try to be better, we shouldn't try to improve. No, I'm not saying that. I think Jesus was the greatest human that ever walked this earth. And I think his disciples, when they finally got it, which took a while, were some of the greatest men and women that ever walked this earth. I think the gospel of Jesus makes you greater, but the way to greatness is not by climbing up, it's by serving down. The way to get greater is not by boosting yourself, it's by living for what's right. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes there's a cross with that. But it's always the better way. And by the way, you become a better person. Because it's about choosing the good, even if it's hard, even if it's countercultural, even if it's not popular. And I don't know where you're at in life right now, but I know all of us every day have to make choices for our life. If you were to reflect on your last week or your last month, how have your choices been? Have you made good choices? Are you happy with the choices you've made? Is your life where you hope it would be or want it to be? If it's not quite happening the way you wish it would, I want to invite you. Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. It will be better. It won't be easier, but it will be better. He will help you to make the right choices. The good choices. Choices that make your life better, make others better. Choices that are in harmony with God. And by the way, this is not about, I think sometimes we get this picture that's about making myself worse. Well, I've got to be less, so I'll just be bad at things, and I'll just tell people I'm a lousy person. It's not about that. The path down is a path of service. It's not a path of degradation and dismissing the value that God has on you. It's about recognizing that I do have value, therefore I don't need to take it from other people. I don't need to compete with other people. They're not my competition. I can serve them and love them because we're all in this together. It's about choosing the right, whether it is easy or hard. Choosing it because it is right. And so the disciples, you see, put that graph back up one more time. You see 3 times, and we won't read all 3 of them, but it's very similar in each case. The disciples hear from Jesus that he's going to be crucified, that he's going to Jerusalem, bad things are going to happen. Every time they misunderstand, they don't like it. And then every time they get into some weird conversation about who's greatest or something that must have really discouraged Jesus. And then Jesus every time gives a little teaching about what he actually came to do and what discipleship means, much like we heard him here at the cross. And at one point he pulls a little child in and he says, you guys, unless you become like this child, like it's not about trying to make yourself great. Just embrace life like a child and leave your worries to your Father. Like, that's what I'm trying to show you. There's a better way. Well, throughout the gospel, Jesus then, chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, he's marching to Jerusalem. By chapter 10, we have the triumphal entry, and then 11, he's clearing the sanctuary, and we're entering that very last week of Jesus' life. And you know, there's something that Peter understands after being with Jesus and reflecting on what Jesus came to say and do. And Peter, of course, as you see from his own gospel, he's got a different perspective, and he's showing you how he had to evolve in his thinking, how he had to grow in his walk with Jesus to understand what it was really about. And one of the things he's trying to help us see is that, you know what, guys? You want to understand who Jesus is? Look at that last week of his life. What he came to do, the sacrifice that he made. It's all right there. Spend some time at the foot of the cross, because you will then be in awe and wonder at this Son of God that gave his life for you. You see, remember the first half was about the Son of God, and every time he did these miracles, every time he cast out demons or calmed the storm or healed somebody, it said the people were astonished. They were in awe. They were amazed at this teacher. But Peter says the real amazing thing is not those miracles. In fact, he just blows through 3 years of Jesus' ministry and says, here's the amazing thing, that he would set his face and march into Jerusalem, knowing that he would be beaten, crucified, that he would be separated from his Father. It's Peter that tells us here on the cross that when Jesus is nailed to the cross, when he's got the crown of thorn pressed in on his head, when blood is flowing down, that Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the thing that should amaze us. This love of God, this incredible sacrifice that he made for you. He didn't have to come. And he didn't have to die if he didn't want to. He chose that. He chose it knowing full well what the costs were going to be. And the only reason he would have done it is because of you and I. Because he saw your face and my face. And he says, I want them forever. I want to live with them. I don't want to say goodbye to them forever. I want to give them hope. I want to make a way. And Jesus has transformed Peter's life. And you know the story. Peter shares the whole thing about how he denies Jesus, how he promises, I won't ever leave you. But he leaves him. He runs away. He abandons him. When Jesus needs prayer, the disciples are sleeping. And it's so interesting in this book because more than any of the 4 Gospels, the disciples are really just awful in the book of Mark. In fact, one commentator says it's like they're the anti-disciples. They're so bad to Jesus, and they're always arguing, confronting him. They're not there when he needs them. They're denying him. They're running away. They're the anti-disciples. Disciples are supposed to be with you. Disciples are supposed to be supporting you. Disciples means they're serving you. You're the master. You're the Lord. You're the teacher. You're the rabbi. They're supposed to be learning from you, but Peter's pulling Jesus aside and trying to teach him. And so you just have this kind of anti-disciple theme running through the book of Mark until the very end, and yet Peter wants us to know, even while I was denying him, he was dying for me. That's the amazing part of who he is. Who is Jesus? He's amazing. He does things that we can't even comprehend. His love is so far beyond any love we've ever seen before. His compassion, his grace, his mercy, his forgiveness is so much more powerful than anything we've ever seen on this planet before. He's an amazing God. Let me take you to the cross. Let us get there. And when we get there, let us slow down and spend time, because none of us got it then. But I'm telling you now who he was. And so Peter has this interesting juxtaposition. He says, when Jesus died, the temple The veil was torn at the moment he passed away. Ripped, torn open is the Greek. The veil is torn open. You get that? That's a very specific choice of words that Peter uses or Mark writes down. It was torn open. What does the open mean? The holy, the most holy place is open because of Jesus' death. The presence of God, this presence of God that had to be hidden, that had to be veiled, that there was a veil so that no one but the high priest could go in, and only that once a year. This place that was so sacred, the presence of God, that man, if he came into the presence of God, would be killed. That is torn open. The way to God is made. Jesus opens that veil. That veil is no longer there. There's no longer any need to separate God from man. And what's interesting is this exact same Greek word started the gospel. In Mark chapter 1, when Jesus was baptized, he says, the heavens were torn open, and down came a dove, and a voice was heard, "This is my beloved Son." So Peter brings it all full circle. Who is this guy? He is God's Son. And even though I didn't get it, even though James and John didn't get it, even though Judas definitely didn't get it, even though the other disciples didn't get it, even though the Jewish leaders didn't get it, I am here to tell you this man was the Son of God, and he gave his life, and it wasn't what we thought it was going to be. He wasn't the Messiah that we had hoped. He wasn't the Messiah that we had talked about. He didn't fulfill the texts in Isaiah and in Zechariah and in Ezekiel that we had hoped he would fulfill, because those are for later. But he was the Son of God, and he did what his mission was to do. And the only proper response is to be amazed and to be in awe. That's what Peter would want you to know about Jesus. And I think he wants you to know that here today, some almost 2,000 years later. So who do you say Jesus is? It's interesting at that cross that they're mocking him, and the religious leaders are heaping scorn and contempt upon Jesus. But when he dies, there's one person, a Roman centurion, a Roman guard, who when Jesus dies exclaims, "Surely this man was the Son of God." It's a Gentile. It's someone who didn't even get it. It's someone from outside the faith. It's someone presumably that was not a very religious person. He's the only one at that cross that recognizes who Jesus is. But I think Peter records it because he said, in that Roman centurion is hope for all of us. Because we don't always get it. We don't know everything we think we know. And even if we're students of the Bible, we still have a lot to learn. But when you're confronted with the cross, only response is, wow, this guy, there was something about him. Something divine has happened here. He must have been the Son of God. And so by ending his story this way, we think Peter is paving the way for the gospel to go to the world. And unless you're a Jew, which I don't think many of us here probably are, this is good news. Because the gospel was for the whole world, Jew and Gentile. And this Roman soldier becomes that symbolic figure saying, the Gentiles will believe. The Gentiles will accept him for who he is. And we see as the story continues through the book of Acts in the first few centuries, how Christianity just takes over the world, and even today becoming the most dominant world religion. From that humble beginning, one man who dared to die for the human race. And so I ask you this morning as we close, who do you say he is? Who is he to you? I want to read you a quote as we close. This is from C.S. Lewis, the book Mere Christianity. If you've never read Mere Christianity, I highly recommend it. It's a great apologetic work on why to be a Christian and why it actually makes logical sense. And in that book, the great author C.S. Lewis challenges us saying this. He challenges the culture. He challenges our world. And he says, let us not say, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. For a man who was merely a man, yet said and did the sort of things that Jesus said and did, would not be a great moral teacher. He would be a lunatic, on the level with the man who said he was a poached egg. Or else he would be the devil himself. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he is a madman or something worse. You can shut him up as a fool. You can spit at him. You can kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great teacher, for he has not left that open to us, and he never intended to. Do you get his point? For Jesus to do and say all the things he did, he couldn't be just another good teacher, because he claimed a lot more than that. And his life was a lot more than that. So either he was delusional, or he was exactly who he claimed to be, the Messiah, God's Son, sent by God, God incarnate, God in the flesh, who came on a mission to save this human race. And the heart of the text was our scripture this morning, the heart of the book of Mark, Mark 10:35, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's who Peter says Jesus is. Who do you say he is?